It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports, bye-week mailbag edition. I'm Craig Hoffman. He is Logan Paulsen. Logan, you enjoying your bye week?
I am enjoying my bye week, yeah, but I was way busier than I thought I would be. I thought, we're going to film all our shows on Monday, but then everything happens, clients and things, and here we are.
Work is a thing that will take the space that you give it. That is something I've learned in life. So if you have a project, and it's a 5-minute project, and you have an hour, it's going to take you an hour. So make sure you block yourself off that 5 minutes and get that sucker done. That is the nature of things. That or you push so many things to the side that you all of a sudden have time, and you're like, oh, I have time to get to the B list. Oh, this got long. Then you don't have time anymore.
Right.
That's unfortunate. All right, so here's what we got today. Got a bunch of great questions via Twitter. Who knew? It's Twitter, place you can still go find good stuff. So thanks to everybody who sent in questions. We're going to try to get to as many of them as we can. And Logan, they start hot. They start fiery. They start straight to the point. Eric Batista, thoughts on trading Terry McLaurin next year? Potential return compensation? And obviously those two questions are tied, but they're also a little bit different. Everyone wants to trade everyone right now, or at least some portion of the fan base wants to trade everyone because that's what happens when you're losing. But there's also a lot of folks that I think rightfully look at Terry as a pillar of this organization and someone that you can build around. So what are your thoughts on the potential of trading? And I'll throw John Allen in this as well, those two guys this offseason.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know how I feel about trading Terry. I mean, obviously, I'm always believe this in the draft. I believe it in free agents. I believe it if the price is right, you got to do it. And so just the question is like, what is your price for Terry? What do you think is good value for him? And I think a lot of fans would, maybe if it's a second round pick, I would engage that conversation and see what's going on and offload the contract and free up some cap space and really do a total rebuild. I personally would probably be less likely to make any kind of definitive move on Terry because I just feel like there is obviously an on-field component to what you're doing, but I do think like there's an off-field element to it as well. And I think he's been a pretty consistent pillar in terms of leadership in the locker room and in the community. He's the Walter Payton Man of the Year nominee. Like he's big time. And it's not just off the field stuff, but I think he's a good football player. I think he's kind of built the right way. You rewarded him, and I think you rewarded him for a reason. So, I mean, obviously, like I said, if the situation's correct, I'm all ears. If you're going to say, hey, here's a first or a second and a third, I'm going to definitely look at it. I'm going to talk to Terry, see what he wants. And I think he's like garnished or earned that kind of respect from the organization and from me. So that's what I would do. With John, I think that's a completely different story because John has made it pretty clear that he's very unhappy here, right? He wants to kind of go and play for a winning organization. And if I'm the head coach and I want him around, I think there's a pretty good opportunity for me to convince him that we're going to be winning a lot of football games here very, very soon. We've got a lot of draft capital, a lot of free agent money. But if I can't convince him, then I'm going to look to see if there's something I can do, right? If the value is there for the trade, if it's like a second and a third or a second and a fourth, it's pretty hard to say no for a guy who's openly said he's considering moving on. I would definitely look at it. And again, like I think the argument for saying we're going to be winning a lot of football games in 2024 is going to be pretty easy to make, especially if we make some good moves in the offseason. And the offseason is always a little bit of a crapshoot, but I think that's kind of how I would approach it. And we don't have all the information, we don't have all the details on kind of totally how those guys are feeling, but I think John's made it very clear that he's open to that. And if he's open to that and the price is right, then I'd probably make a move. And that sounds pretty crass, I'm sure, calloused, but that's the nature of the NFL as a business, I think. Right. So
yeah, it is. And that's, I think, what John's saying too, is like, John made it very clear he would like to win here, but the win comes before the here. And that's understandable for a guy who's been here for 7 years and seen the stuff that he's seen. I also think that for John, I'm a little more willing to do it also if I'm just going totally cold and crass. Like, I feel like there's probably more good years ahead of Terry than ahead of John in terms of their absolute peaks.
Sure.
John may be at his peak or at the end of his peak, where Terry, and that's the nature of the position, the body size, the body types. John did a lot of injury stuff. Part of the reason he fell to where he did in the draft, where the Commanders could even take him, is because there was a bunch of injury concerns about him, and that's a calculation that Washington can make, and they have the better medical information on him versus a team that's just going to be able to perform a physical after they've already completed a trade. So there's that kind of stuff that you're wondering about too, on the Allen side. On the McLaurin side, like, I agree with you on the larger guiding principle here of, like, if the price is right, you got to do it. I just think with Terry, like, my price is very high.
Yeah.
Now, to be clear, very high is like, yeah, if someone wants to offer you a high second round pick, then you have to consider it, considering how much money you owe him and what that could mean, and how you've spent some of your draft capital and potentially what's available to you in this draft. If all of a sudden you're picking third in this draft and someone offers you a second for Terry, knowing you can go get Marvin Harrison Jr., that becomes a different story potentially.
Sure.
And by the way, Malik Neighbors is also sick, the kid out of LSU. A lot of people have him going top 7 or so. So if that's the case, then, then that affects your price, right? Is you decide what your price is. But it's not just Terry on the field, like you said, that sets the price. He is the ultimate worker. He's the right kind of guy to lead your organization. I think in many ways, I wish he would have been more vocal at times over the last couple of years. He chooses his spots, and I think he could have been, at times when there were some louder voices in the room, perhaps I would have preferred to hear Terry's voice instead. I just think he goes about it all the right way. Like you said, Walter Payton Man of the Year, tremendous off the field and in the community, a guy who'll be beloved here forever, and should be. And by the way, John should be well respected here forever too, and for all that he's done. But Terry, especially if you're shaping a young quarterback, like, I want a guy like Terry around, someone who's a great weapon, but also is not going to be a jerk about it as well. And so I'm not super keen on trading Terry McLaurin. The other guy that we didn't mention that I will mention here just to say why we didn't mention him is Daron Payne. Those are now considered like the bona fide 3 best guys on the team. Because they signed Daron last offseason, you lose, like, it becomes a cap penalty. Like, I need 2 first-round picks for Daron Payne because it's also going to hurt my salary cap. And no one's giving you 2 first-rounders for Daron Payne. So that's why we didn't mention Daron in that. Anything else to add on to John or Terry?
I think just the thing about Terry that I would also point out is there does seem to be, like, this is from like a broader picture roster building perspective, is, I do think receivers are nearing the space where they're going to start getting devalued. I just think the market is so saturated, especially in the draft and free agency. You can find really good players. So maybe you that boils into the calculation at some point, saying, hey, as much as we love Terry and as much as he's a big part of what we want and hope to be, we can, if we get a second round pick, we can get a guy to replace Terry McLaurin with that pick, because there's just so much depth in the wide receiver, in the college wide receiver ranks. I mean, there's just, everyone's running 4 wides. Everyone's got, guys who have 1,000 yards receiving that have sick kind of run after the catch, and they're very, very well polished. So that's another thing that might factor into that. But again, I agree with you. I think he's probably a guy who ends up staying, just from, like, the recency of the contract and his kind of his leadership in the locker room.
I also think he's like, John, you might be selling, like, I don't know, people still know what John Allen is, right? Terry has a down year, but I think Terry's a better football player than this. I think John's a better football player than this, and I think the injury in the preseason has hurt him a lot this year. But like, the idea that, like, a year ago, no one would be considering trading Terry McLaurin, and I still think he's the football player he was a year ago. He just had a weird bad year in a new offense with a young quarterback that he hasn't exactly gotten on the same page with. All right, let's go to Danny's question next. At Worky77, which up to now Fringe player would you like to see more of for the rest of the season? This is actually a tough question.
It's a really good question,
because I feel like a lot of the guys have played, whether by design or by necessity.
Right. So the guys that come to mind are like Quan, who's playing more now, which I'm excited to see. Percy Butler, he's been playing a lot, and I think he's been playing better. I think defensive line-wise, you got the young defensive ends. They're getting a lot of burn at the moment. I think the only guy that I would even kind of throw out there would be Chris Rodriguez, just to see him get a little bit more touches. He might have an opportunity with B-Rob being hurt. I think he's shown us what kind of player he is. I think there's good value there. But, if you want to see a young guy get some more opportunity, maybe that's the solution. And then I would say maybe one of the young tight ends. Curtis Hodges has been inactive every single game. I don't think he's ready to be active yet. But, maybe Cole Turner gets some more opportunities in the passing game or more, whatever that is. And again, I don't need to see that because I don't think he's earned that opportunity. But if is a guy that you're like, oh, hey, what about this guy? Maybe those are some names that come to mind. Jabril Cox at linebacker, again, I don't think he's earned the opportunity yet. I think Cody and Jamin are showing good signs and they're playing good football, especially the last 2 weeks. So I don't really feel like a necessity for that, but those are some names that come to mind. I was just trying to think of across the offensive line if there was anybody any young player.
Stromberg's hurt. That's the bummer.
Yeah. So he'd be the guy.
Yeah. If Stromberg could get back, I'd probably play him at center. Sorry, Tyler Larson.
Yeah.
I would consider that. But Braden Daniels is on IR. He's not even an option. He was IR before the year. He's not an option. And there's all your draft picks. Could you see a Mitchell Tinsley maybe?
That's what I was going to say. Mitchell Tinsley or Bryson Tremaine maybe as a special teams guy, just to see if they could do it when the lights are on Sunday. And I think they both had good preseasons, and so it wouldn't be as a starting receiver, but it would be in a special teams capacity, because I think sometimes those are good opportunities for guys to kind of get their feet wet and show what they can or can't do. I think Christian Holmes is a perfect example of that. So. Those guys would be interesting, but nobody that I think all the guys that I want to see are playing at the moment, and it's just kind of some of those fringe guys. If you have a hankering, I could see that, but I don't think they've earned that opportunity.
I just want a consistent role for the guys that are already out there. Emmanuel Forbes needs to play 100% of the snaps. Quan Martin needs to be out there on a regular basis, and once you get past that in this draft class, you're down to Chris Rodriguez pretty quick. So
and then KJ, I think, but KJ's been playing. He's playing a lot. He's a rotational starter now. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. All right. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of free agency money spent this offseason. They're, depending on what they make move-wise, they're going to have somewhere between $80 and $100 million in cap space. They move on from a guy like Logan Thomas. That frees up a significant amount of cash. I believe Charles Leno's in the same boat. So there's opportunities to create more cap space or to keep some veterans around to help either with depth or just as mentors, or maybe start, depending on what your plan is and what your scheme is next year. But this question is, I think, an interesting one from the Spear at Pay the Man on Twitter. Granted, we need to be patient with the product on the field, but what are the top 3 things ownership has done to improve the conditions for free agents? How would the players survey go this year? Cold showers were not a good look.
Well, I think honestly, the number one thing is that they are new owners. I think that's the number one thing. I think people underestimate how the drama around Dan, and by extension the team, made it really unappetizing to come here. I think Harris, I think his patience has been excellent. I think that's something that needs to be lauded and kind of just applauded in general, just because it's great. It just shows such a difference in approach. And so I do think that's a big deal. I think having the money to spend is also a big deal too, money talks and getting guys up here. And I just think I really can't, just from talking to people around the league, overstate how important just the ownership changes and how this becomes a way more appetizing position. And, people talk about the facilities. I've been all over the NFL, and these facilities, while not amazing, to me are not that far of a departure from what other places I was at. So I think it's important for fans to understand, you're getting paid a lot of money to play NFL football. If the price is right, I don't care if the showers are cold. I really don't. I'm going to play football. So I think, and when you're at the practice facility, that's really not been an issue there. They have hot water, they have cold tubs, they have a great wet works facility.
FedEx is a, again, they inherited it so late. They're going, and Harris is already committed to making that a better place. But the practice facility is the one that needs to be upgraded to impress free agents. You need to walk, if you're going to come visit, which a lot of guys don't even do anymore. You're talking about the top free agents will actually take a visit. Most guys are on the phone with their agents going, who's going to offer me the most money? Sick. I'll sign. Yeah. But if you do take a visit, you want to see, good stuff. And I think that there's already been some improvements made. And there's been kind of incremental improvements that I think Jason Wright and company have headed up in some capacity, that they were just kind of hoping that Harris would pay for in green light when they got there. And Ron, obviously, on the football side of that as well, has been helping to spearhead that. But at the end of the day, this is a critical offseason for some of that stuff. And I think
But
the biggest
that seems
thing,
more like a long-term thing, though. Like moving practice
because
facilities.
they might move the practice facility entirely.
Right. No, and that's I think we see that the same way.
Yeah, for sure. In terms of things they've already done as well, like the investment in analytics and being a modern, cutting edge organization, like you can sell that to a player and to an agent, being like, hey, we know how to utilize your guys. Like we have a modern football operation. So hiring Eugene Chen, and then obviously by the time free agency will have come around, they will have hired a new GM and a new head coach, and that coach should have a top flight staff, and those guys are all going to be paid very well. I think that stuff is the most important thing. Like who do you want to play for? Do they have a clear vision? Can they sell that vision? Right. So that's hasn't been done yet. In terms of things that have already been done, I mean, I
think that's the thing fans need to understand, though. There's not a lot that they can do right now, in my opinion. Like it's
they've actually done, like they've improved FedEx, they've improved the practice facility, they've started making football hires. Like they've done about as much as you possibly can do. It's just the can-do list is not very long.
And so that's why I'd say that the most important element coming out of this is just that you've shown a good patience as an owner and you've shown a different leadership approach. And so I think, like to your point, you hire a GM, he's not going to get fired in the same year. You're going to hire a coach, he's not going to get fired in the same year. It provides a little bit of stability when making those decisions for a player. And I do think this is a very appetizing place to play if you're a free agent. Like living out in Ashburn is a great spot to raise a family. Having the access to DC is important. Like this is a good spot to be. And irrespective of facilities, which sounds like they'll be improved over the next 3 to 5 years, like that's great. But this is very appetizing. I think the things you're talking about, like having a patient owner, hiring a GM, hiring a head coach, having a 4-year vision, knowing that a player coming in can be a part of that vision or a 5-year vision, whatever it is, I think is so important to attracting free agents, because the area is great. I mean, you've been in DC, it's fantastic, right? So there's not like that stuff will take care of itself. I think this new ownership element is huge. And I think in terms of upgrading facility, that seems like something that'll happen when they decide where they want the actual practice facility to be.
Yeah, personnel is the most important thing. And then I will say the one thing they've also done is re-energize the fan base. Like it's reminded players like, hey, did you see the footage from DC when Harris bought the team? Did you see the first couple of weeks at FedEx Field? Like that place was rocking. If we can get a winning product going there, like we're going to have fan support. And I think that's an important thing that the Harris ownership group has already done. That will continue to show in the future. Obviously, might be a few rough couple weeks if the Miami game and how many Dolphins fans there were any indication. Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. Craig Hoffman here, Logan Paulson there. Mailbag edition of the show here on the Commanders bye week. All right, next question comes from our guy Teresh, who's just Teresh works like behind the scenes in media. And he just always has the coolest facts. He always has the coolest stuff where like great data, great this, great thinking, just great, like thought-provoking questions. So he goes, I'd like for you, or for Logan and you, to share some examples of things he noticed from assistant coaches he's worked with that showed him they were capable of leading a franchise as a head coach and not just an X's and O's guy.
Hey, that's a really good question, because it's kind of hard to know. There is an element of like, this dude's a brilliant football guy, right? Like I think let's just take the guys that I worked with, like Sean McVay, for example. I think it was very clear very early on that he was going to be something special, because he had this ability not only to like understand football, and football was important to him, and he was a grinder and a worker, but he also had this tremendous ability to relate to players, right? Like he'd go through the hallway, hey, Logan, what's up? Hey, London, how you doing? And he'd have a little joke, and it was like very easy and for him to kind of relate to every single person. You take someone like Mike McDaniels, who was obviously very smart, even when he was here, very, very smart. And then again, in San Francisco, very, very smart, but his personality is a little bit different. And you've seen that in like the countless social media clips. Like he's a little bit quirky, a little bit funny, a little sarcastic. And you're kind of like, how is that going to play in front of a group? And there was a period of time before I got with him in San Fran, where I was like, I think he's a brilliant coach, but I'm not sure how that's going to play when he's the head coach. But again, he's kind of taken his personality and found a way to relate to players. Kyle too, I think, is interesting. Kyle, when I first was here with him, was a little bit standoffish. He wouldn't say hi to you. It was very kind of in his own head, very like a beautiful mind. I'm thinking about something all the time. And when he got to San Fran, or when I went to San Fran and he got the head coaching job, it was cool to see him kind of take the thing that he was excellent at and use that to relate to players. So he would never do a team meeting without film in front of him. And he kind of laid the foundation through watching film and showing players his command of football. And then everyone's like, oh my gosh, Kyle's awesome. I respect Kyle. Defensive guys, like the way he installed that cover 3 or the way he talked about our cover 3, he knows what's up. He's going to get us right. And then it took him probably 1.5 to 2 years, but then he started doing the Sean McVay, kissing babies, shaking hands type of thing. And that totally changed. And so I think if there's one thing that is so important for a position coach, it's that they are, in my opinion, in my experience, even Matt LaFleur was like this. Matt LaFleur was probably more similar to Sean. Smart guy, extremely obsessed with football would be the other thing that's important. Obsessed with football. And he had that kind of charisma. And you see that up in Green Bay. So I think that to me is the main thing. Are they obsessed with football? Like obsessed with football, like eat, sleep, drink football? Because that's what those guys are. They sleep at the facility. They talk about football. Kyle, I remember saying, like, the way I value you as a person is how you approach football. And that's how they all are. They're all super dialed in like that. So are they obsessed with football, and can they relate to the players? And I think the thing that those 4 examples show you is that everyone can relate in different ways as long as you find that mode of connection that helps you convey your obsession with football at a high level.
What I think is interesting about those guys, having listened to the Playmaker series, and I just read a long Washington Post profile a couple weeks ago on McDaniel, is I don't know if they would agree with the last part to the extent they did when they coached you. I think all of them, as they've gotten a little bit older, have gained some perspective. McDaniel specifically talks about this in the Post piece, where he's like, I can't sleep at the facility anymore. Like, I just refuse to do that because I realized I wasn't as good of a coach, because sleep is really important. You hear him say in a team meeting during Hard Knocks, or a team huddle after a practice on the short week, he's like, go sleep. Sleep is the most important thing you will do this week. Please go sleep. And so I do think it's interesting how the concept of a human touch evolves over the course of a coaching arc and a career. As people evolve as human beings. I know Sean just became a dad for the first time. And I think that when he got super burnt out a couple of years ago and was ready to retire, like, he and his wife, Veronica, looked at things and were like, maybe we need to find ways to take a step back a little bit.
Absolutely.
But I think that like there's still an obsession there, and learning out how to channel it is something that happens as you get older and you progress in your career. There's another great saying that I love just generally. This is like great life advice more than it is like football coaching, but grind when you're young so you don't have to when you're old. Like, you learn how to work smarter as you get going. But what doesn't get lost is the obsession. How it manifests itself is certainly super important. So if I am looking for a younger head coach, I want someone who has that grind, that last one in the facility, burn the midnight oil type of attitude, where I'm a little less concerned about that if they're a little bit older and they have a more advanced mastery of it. But what's important through all of that, the through lines are exactly what you said. Obsession with football, and do you have the human touch? And I think I've told this story before, but I was with McVay at one point, and there was a TV on, and he there's the NFL Top 100, and Jordan Reed pops up, and he's wherever he is on the list that given year, and he just immediately is like, I gotta text Reed, and it's like the middle of the offseason, and he's texting Jordan Reed, like, just being like, man, you're the best, like, you're so great, like, I'm so lucky to coach you. Like, he had a way of building guys up, and a way of connecting with them, and a way of making them feel seen and valued. And McDaniel talks about this a lot. If you read some of his stuff, if you watch the in-season Hard Knocks, like that way. And like Kyle, it sounds like he went about it differently, where he'd be like, I care about you if you can help me win football games.
But it's also
he made you feel valued.
But to your point, though, it changed. It evolved. It started as this very austere, very serious thing, and then the personal touch developed. But I'm saying it started for him in his mastery and his relationship to football. And I think and the other thing, I think there's a third element here. Like, those dudes are all brilliant guys. And I don't use that as like I'm not being hyperbolic there. Like, they are brilliant guys. Like, when you sit and talk to them about football, you're like, you are one of the top 10 smartest people on the planet on this subject matter. And they would kind of downplay that, obviously, but like, it's obvious, the proof's in the pudding. So I would just say it's that obsession, but there needs to be a natural gift. And I think you just in the interview process, you'd be able to see that, right? There's a lot of smart guys, but are there those special guys? And all four of those guys that we talked about, even LaFleur, he gets forgotten a little bit in that mix, but he's one of those guys too. They have a grind, they have a process. It's a very clear vision. I think that's the other thing that is getting a little bit more technical as opposed to those kind of major points we alluded to, is they understand their vision very, very clearly for what it is. And so in that interview process, if the guy's like, oh yeah, we could do this or we could do this, I don't know if he's the right guy for me, because I want him to say like, this is where I think football is at now. This is where I think offensively we can take football. And I think they all had a good understanding of that. I think Sean in his first or second year in LA, when that offense really innovated and they did some really high level stuff, like he took football to the next level. Sean, LaFleur, I mean, you see McDaniel in Miami doing it all the time. LaFleur this year elevating Jordan Love. Like you just see how they understand how to maximize what they're doing, how they the hunger to bring in defenses that give them a hard time and work against them every single day. Like there's something really special technically in the drive, but also you can't forget about, like, obviously there's the brick and mortar stuff that you're building. Oh, we're building offense, we're talking football, the intellectual stuff, but there's also the interpersonal stuff, which they've all mastered. So I think those are things that I would really just kind of, if I'm hiring, those are things I'm looking for.
Yeah. And then, I mean, the other thing that I would say is you have to be able to teach it. And that's like, and I'm just trying to think of other things too, where like, I think of Brandon Staley in LA. I don't know why he's not working.
Right.
Like he is to defensive football what those other guys seem to be offensively, like the way he thinks about it. And he obviously went toe to toe with Sean for a couple of years in practice. Like he's one of the number one Vic Fangio disciples. Like he was the one who invented a lot of this like star coverage and was like, you want to know what? We got Jalen Ramsey. We're not going to play Jalen Ramsey at corner. We're not going to play him at nickel. We're going to play Jalen Ramsey at Jalen Ramsey. Like he figured out how to do that in an effective way to feature certain skill sets. And he seems to be very in touch on an interpersonal level with players and the way he talks about like humanity and that kind of stuff. And it just hasn't worked. And so I wonder like what I would want to know what the shortcoming is for Brandon Staley that McVay and Shanahan and McDaniel and LaFleur have, and like know what that thing is, and then make sure that the guy that I'm going after doesn't just check 3 of 4 boxes, if you will, but checks 4 of 4,
Yeah, I think the thing that I would assume, and I haven't worked with Brandon Staley, obviously, and I don't know him, but having dealt with people that have worked with him, there's a competitiveness in Sean, in Kyle, in LaFleur, in McDaniels that is high level. Like, so they're going to compete in practice. They're going to while still maintaining, like, I think you can go 2 ways, like as a coach, right? You can kind of push your glasses up your nose and be overly technical and be overly nerdy, right? And I mean that with all due respect, because that's how I am as a person. I'm overly nerdy when it comes to football. And you can also kind of be overly sympathetic, but you got to remember that football is a violent, physical game, and I want violent, physical, competitive sons of guns, and I need to lead those people in a way that gets that out of them. I think that's where you see, like, when you watch San Francisco and you watch the defense and you watch the mindset, you watch the run game, like it's awesome, but that's a culture that they've bred there, and you can see them
take it out of the same tree that we're always in, like Dan Campbell in Detroit.
A perfect example. Love that example, right? There's a toughness, there's a mindset, there's a culture there that's fantastic. So I think that's something that I would kind of point to and say, like, you need to walk that line really carefully of saying, I'm really smart. I relate to players really well, but also I know how to push and get this kind of this barbarian out of them and get them to execute it in this way. So, and it's a fine balance, and there's a reason it's hard to find good young head coaches. But I think when you look at like DeMeco Ryans in Houston, and again, he's kind of from that Kyle tree, like, smart guy, relates to players well, but also no one would doubt that he's an absolute warrior. I played against him when he was in Philly. Like, he's an absolute warrior. And I'm sure he brings that mindset to his coaching philosophy. Saleh,
Sirianni seems to have that in Philly, speaking of.
Yeah, and yeah, that's exactly right. You see Sirianni getting after it and getting fired up. And I think when you look at Saleh, like, he's the nicest guy you've ever met, but he is a competitive son of a gun who knows how to motivate guys to play hard. And I think that's another thing that you see in some of these young kind of rising head coaches that's so important. It's the relationship to the players, but it's also, can you motivate that kind of primal aggression, I think, is also something I would look to.
Yeah, Dable, I think, has that in New York. Obviously, both New York coaches are dealing with pretty crappy rosters right now, so the records don't necessarily reflect it. But I would agree with you on Saleh. Like, he's a great example of it. You watch Hard Knocks, the preseason edition, and like ready to run through a wall for that guy.
Yeah.
I think that's a great call. Which leads us to the obvious follow-up before we take our final break here. Is there someone out there right now who you think fits that mold, who you're looking at? Like, what's the wish list? I know we're doing the same list as everybody else at this point to an extent. Like, we haven't, but you also know people around the league, so maybe you do have a slightly different list. And one of the names that's going to come up is a guy you know very well, and Frank Smith, who's the OC down in Miami, was your tight ends coach in some previous stops. I look at him. I look at Ben Johnson in Detroit, who I'll talk about more in a second. Anybody else that's on the list that you think fits that mold that we were just talking about?
I mean, those two guys for sure, because it's easy to kind of draw a corollary to offensive coaches. But for me, like, Dan Quinn has to be on the list. Like, he's a guy that I have the utmost respect for, having played for him in Atlanta, a guy that I think understands, this is something that I think is so important, understands the importance of offensive football. Like, you're a defensive coach, you got to make sure that offensive hire is out of this world. And it's something that he talked about with me after he left Atlanta, was like, just, hey, like, that's something I really got to prioritize. So knowing that that's on his agenda, I think Raheem Morris, a guy that was here, I was with him in Atlanta also. I know he's been in LA. I know he's one of the brightest football guys I've been around. He knows how to relate to players, and hopefully, from his first stint in Tampa, he's learned how to motivate guys and kind of get that competitive edge out of them. So I think those are two guys on the defensive side of the ball that I would point to. Obviously, Bobby Slowick, I know he's only been a year coordinator down in Houston, but what he's done down there is tremendous. Like, it is tremendous. And again, that's all Kyle. That's the Kyle Shanahan tree just continuing. But I think having an understanding of what Kyle does, what McDaniel does, what LaFleur does, what Sean does, what some of the best offenses in football do, and have that hunger, have that drive, and be able to relate to the younger players, I think, is another thing that's so important. And you see that with Dan, the way that defense is playing, they relate to him, right? You see that
with hat DQ.
Yeah, and you see that with Raheem and the defenses that he coaches. So I think those guys are some names that I want to interview them, I want to talk to them, but having played with them and having watched the product that they've cultivated over the last 3, 4, 5 years in some cases, like I would feel very I would assume that they've evolved in their coaching perspectives and are ready for that opportunity.
Yeah, I think those are all really good names. So my guy's always been the guy from Detroit, Ben Johnson.
Yeah, Ben Johnson.
The OC.
Ben Johnson.
Yeah, the OC from the Detroit Lions, and Dan Campbell obviously is a huge part of that culture there. He's the tone setter. But you look at their first year when they had Anthony Lynn, and then what they did with Jared Goff years 2 and 3 now with Johnson as the OC, and he's able to create one of the league's best offenses without a super elite premier quarterback, and that is incredibly appealing. Like, is Sam Howell more likely to be Jared Goff than Patrick Mahomes? Hell yeah, he is. And so, can I create a league's best offense with him and Amon-Ra St. Brown level? Like, Amon-Ra St. Brown's incredible. But is he Jamar Chase? No. Does he produce like Jamar Chase? Damn near. For long stretches of seasons he does. Right. So I like that guy. And I was even more sold on this last week when we had Adam Amin on the radio show. And Adam, Fox Sports play-by-play, who obviously did the Commanders game with Mark Schlereth last week. Adam's had Detroit a couple times over the last couple years. And I asked him, I was like, hey, you get to do all these production meetings, and you get to talk to coaches, you get to talk to OCs, you get to talk to DCs. Is there anybody that really stands out to you as like, that guy's ready for a head coaching job? And he hasn't had everybody, so this is not to discount anyone that you just named that Adam might not have had an interaction with. I'd actually be curious to follow up with him and see what he thought of Frank Smith down in Miami because he hadn't had their production meetings with Miami yet, and that was his first time having Miami this year. But he goes, Ben Johnson is in a total class of his own. Like, his ability to command a room, his ability to do all the head coachy stuff, even though he's the OC, is right there. And it's one broadcaster's opinion in a production meeting. But, like, we in this field have seen a lot of stuff. Adam's talked to a lot of people over the years. Like Adam is done college football. He's done the NFL. He's done the NBA. Like Adam's been around a lot of really good coaches in his career. And if he's like, that dude's got it, I tend to trust that evaluation. Obviously, Adam can't tell you what his X's and O's are. Can't tell you what he's like behind the scenes. But like that it factor that you want in the head coach that Sean has, that Kyle has, that Matt has, that Zach Taylor has in Cincinnati, that Kevin has in Minnesota, that the best coaches in this league have. Very clearly, Ben Johnson has it. And so he has consistently been at the top of my list. And I also think philosophically, I like the way he thinks about the game. And I would say the same is true for Smith. I would assume for most of the other names you mentioned as well, like the prioritization of getting your best players the ball, being creative in how you do that, and a healthy run-pass balance that makes your quarterback's job easier on the offensive side. Like that is the philosophy that I think is best in the modern NFL. That's what I would be looking for. I'm not Josh Harris, so we'll see.
No, but I think that's when you're looking for an offensive perspective and a cultural perspective, I think it doesn't get much better than that. You know, like you talk about a culture and turning around really quickly and having a clear vision. Like he's been part of that. He's been part of that build. And I think that's another reason why Frank Smith is so appealing too, is they've been part of a culture shift, you know, and it's all stemmed from an offensive philosophy. But like you see the importance in McDaniel's case of, and again, I reference McDaniel's because Frank is under his tutelage, like Ben is under Dan. Like they made the decision to go hire Vic Fangio this offseason. They made the decision to go get Tyreek Hill. They made the decision to bring in Jalen Ramsey. You look at Dan Campbell's drafts. You look at the perspective that they have as a physical team. Like you've seen how to build a roster and then maximize the most important position of football in both instances, right? Both those guys are playing above their skis and they're good football players, but they're also playing better because of the coaching, right? And the stuff that they've done there to kind of maximize those players. So I think he's the best candidate in football right now. And I think if I'm him, I'd probably go to San Diego to the Chargers because of the Herbert connection. But again, like this job I think is going to be very appealing, and maybe you put something out there, you get a good land there, and I think he'd be excellent. But I think all those guys I just mentioned, even Shane Day up in Seattle, you know, the offensive coordinator there. Shane Waldron, excuse me. Yeah. I think is another interesting guy too. You know, a guy that's been around.
Schematically, I know he's got it. I don't know if he's got the other stuff. And that's truly, I don't know.
Yeah, and I know Shane because he was here on this staff. Like, think about that. Like, how crazy this is. Like this Washington tree. He was here, and he's an excellent guy. Now, can he be that leader? And the question is, I don't know. But a lot of, like I just said, like when I went through our like little Rolodex of coaches that we know, I didn't know for those guys either. But they grew and they developed, and to me, it's the football mind and the obsession that you see. But I do think those two guys we mentioned at the top are really high on the list. Obviously, the two defensive coaches we mentioned are pretty high on my list as well because they've seen that thing we're trying to get here in Washington, and they understand how to do it. So I think that's what I would. But again, there's a lot of really bright dudes out there from bright organizations.
Last thing I'll say real quick, score some brownie points with Logan, but also I firmly believe this. I love a tight ends coach. A guy with a tight ends coach background because he understands the pass game. He understands the run game. Like tight end is the ultimate position in terms of understanding everything: pass pro, run blocking, route running, like how you interact with the quarterback. Tight ends coaches tend to do that as well as anyone. Like Sean, former tight ends coach. Yeah. McDaniel did some tight ends work in his day.
Well, he was, a run game. Like think about his progression: receiver to run game coordinator. And I think like that point you're talking about, he has the pass protection and the run game stuff in conjunction with the passing game. And so I think you got to look for that in that guy, in that offensive
Ben Johnson line. And Frank Smith, tight ends coaches by trade. Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports, wrapping up here with Logan Paulsen. I am Craig Hoffman on a mailbag edition during the bye week. We had some really great questions. It sparked some very good discussions. Last one or one of the last ones here, Logan, another big picture. We kind of just touched on this, but what would be you and Logan's organizing principle from which you would rebuild this organization? For example, team speed, positional scheme, or flexibility. What is kind of your organizing principle? What's the Logan Paulsen football mantra that you are looking to hire a GM to execute, a head coach to execute, and players to fulfill?
I mean, that's an excellent question. That's a really fantastic question. One we should probably redo in the offseason, maybe, but high level, I think, I look at what Philadelphia has done from a roster construction standpoint in terms of building through the offensive line, building through the defensive line, and watching good defenses and just how important, like if you have a good offensive line, to beat a good defensive line, how important that is, and how your defensive line elevates your coverage unit. And so I think that's something that I would lean to. But I think the other thing about Philly that's interesting is the way they stockpile draft capital, the way they develop talent. I think that's something that people always lose sight of. If I have good position coaches, if they've got the second or first best offensive line coach in football, they develop Jordan Mailata, they develop the guard they've got playing now. Their third string guard's been playing for 5 weeks and no one even bats an eye about it because they've developed these players. I'm sure they've drafted well, but also developing those positions, right? And so I look at then making those investments in the big skill position players and identifying talent really well. So for me, if I would keep it as high level as possible, I want to develop through the offensive and defensive line, which is not a new premise, but I really want to make sure that my position coaches and the team philosophy is to develop talent. And if we can do that, obviously, like we've talked about the schematic elements that I think are so important. Like I want to hire the best offensive coordinator that I can find. I want to hire the best defensive coordinator that I can find. I want guys who are going to promote to head coaches in 2 years. And I want to have a staff that's full of guys where I feel comfortable from promoting within. And I think if I get a staff like that and I get guys that are hungry and passionate and developing young players, we're going to be all right. And so again, GM-centric model probably, because I don't want my coach worried about too much personnel stuff, but I want that relationship to be something that I saw, something similar to what I saw in San Fran, where Kyle and John are working very closely in concert in terms of identifying talent and making big decisions. But yeah, man, I want my staff to be awesome, and I want them to be thinking about building people so we don't have to be perfect on the draft board or perfect in free agency. I want really, really good coaches.
Yeah, I love that. And I will add on to that and say I want really great coaches with a cohesive football approach, right? And so what I mean by that is, does your pass game marry your, like that to me is like such a silly little litmus test that should be so easy to pass. Does your run game and your pass game marry? Like does your play action game look like your run game? And there's been plenty of systems that don't do that and are successful. I hate it. I just, in modern NFL 2023 football, I want to play games with defenses, really test their rules, and something as simple as a cohesive pass and run game means that the formations are going to match up and marry, that like all these little things are going to come together. So how do you think about football in a way that is cohesive, that makes sense? Because that also is going to inform every other decision you make. And I think one of the flaws of this current Commanders team is they don't have a cohesive philosophy, and they drafted to be this run heavy team and defense first. And then they brought in EB, and it's not that EB is a terrible offensive coordinator, or anything like that, but he's not the right one for this team because they weren't built this way. And so in a year where you had to win, you bring in the guy who passes it more than anybody else in the league for a team that was built to run the football and play defense. Like that's not cohesive. It doesn't work together. So defensively, I want someone who understands what I'm trying to do offensively, and they're okay with that. I want my general manager and my scouts to understand the kinds of players we're looking for, because schematically, this is what we're trying to accomplish. And unless you have a clear and cohesive idea of how to play football, and this is not necessarily a correct one, right? Like it doesn't have to be West Coast with tons of motion and a zillion formations. If you have a clear way that you can convince me as an owner that I can be very simplistic in an Air Coryell system with not a lot of motion and it's going to work, but because we have these players and this, that, and this, that, okay. Like, as long as you understand how it's going to work. I'm probably because I work with you a ton and I've covered like West Coast teams. Like I'm biased towards the West Coast offense. I'm biased towards the things that McDaniel and Shanahan and McVay and O'Connell believe in. But like at the end of the day, is it clear? Is it cohesive? Can you teach it well? And that goes back to the staff. And thus, if you find people to work for you that have that same clear vision, I think we're going to be pretty successful. And so that's how I think about it.
No, I think, and then you kind of took it to another level of detail. But I think it, and then when you have these conversations, it starts with getting the right people in place, right? It starts with those coaching hires, and the more I've covered the NFL, the more you realize that those coaches are so important because of the things you're talking about, because of that ability to find the cohesion throughout the staff, to have guys that are competitive and trying to get their guys better in the context and the vision of the offensive coordinator, right? They're hungering for that next promotion. I want to hire a tight end coach that wants to be an OC, quarterback coach that wants to be an OC. My assistant O-line coach, I don't want him to be okay with being an assistant O-line coach. I want him to be ready to be the head O-line coach. You know what I'm saying? And I want him to hire somebody that does that. And I want them to develop those guys, and all in that, under the guise of that consistent vision. And I think that all starts with making sure you hire the right guy at the top, the right GM, and then make sure that they have an understanding. And I've heard this in interview process before. They've said, who's going to be your staff? And I hope that they have that if that guy doesn't have a clear vision of who he wants his staff to be, then I would be very leery of that, because I want someone, because it's not just him. The head coach has the vision, and then they're going to communicate down to everybody else, and they're going to get the information to the players. So.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have any other things that we want to talk about? Oh, I remember what I was stalling because I knew I had another question in the back of my head. You tell me whether this is worth an entire segment next week that we should do versus answering it as a mailbag question from Craig_Hoffman on Instagram right now, which is the idea of bringing in another OC, right? Third system in 3 years for Sam.
Oh,
is that a big deal? You want to tackle that next week?
Yeah, we can do that next week. We can do it now quickly, but next week's probably
Tell you what, I feel like it's a good tease for people to subscribe and make sure that they're locked in next week, because I think that's a really interesting thing that seems to be splitting DC media and fan spaces of, when you consider Eric Bieniemy's candidacy for OC or head coach here, splitting he and Sam up, depending on how these next 4 games go, especially, is learning a third system in 3 years a huge deal? Would it even be learning a new system, depending on who you hire, within the gigantic realm of West Coast offense? So we will discuss that next week, potentially with a guest. We're working on some stuff, but obviously we will get you ready for the Rams on this pod next week. Maybe some old Sean McVay stories. That could be fun. And we will answer more of your questions and get you ready for still just a lot of off-season priming as we get through this December and await the next generation of Commanders football. Thanks for sticking with us throughout this. It's obviously not been a super fun season, talk about a bunch of stuff, but we appreciate everyone who's continued to listen, subscribe, watch, however it is that you consume the podcast. We really appreciate it. And we have this is going to be a heck of an off season. So we're really excited. So make sure did you get your friends on board now? Be like, hey, I know you're waiting for the off season, but you really should listen to these Take Command guys. They're pretty good. They know a thing or two. So for Logan Paulson, who knows lots of things, I'm Craig Hoffman, who knows a few things. And I'll see y'all Friday on the radio. And we'll see you back here next week for Take Command. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command. First, why don't you like it? It lets other people know that it was good, and then they should watch it too. And Logan, we have a new exclusive home for full episodes.
We do. 1067 The Fans YouTube page. Go check it out and please subscribe.
Yeah, do what Logan said.
Do it.
Very, very smart.